right, good morning. Welcome to the next session of Understanding LDS History. I think this is 13 or 14. I've lost count, but thank you for being here this morning. If you're watching online, thank you so much for tuning in. I do hope these classes are a blessing to you and that you learn from them. And as always, I know I say this every week, but I really mean it every week. My goal in these classes, with God's help, is to be kind and respectful to people that I would disagree with theologically a great deal. And most of us here, or most watching this, we are evangelical Christians and we differ theologically in very significant ways with our Mormon friends and neighbors. And we want to be able to talk about those disagreements, and I hope I can do that in a way that makes clear why we believe what we believe, but at the same time, I want to be respectful and gentle in providing those answers, and I hope my speech can be gracious as we do so. We left off last week. We're spending a couple weeks looking at 1846, where the church has been run out of Nauvoo. They find themselves scattered out across Iowa, and they spend most of 1846 when they realize that we can't make it west this year before the snow flies. There's no way we can get to the Salt Lake Valley, so we're going to be stuck here. And so for that year in 1846, they end up in what has come to be known as winter quarters, where 4,000 of the church were on the west side of the Missouri River in modern-day Nebraska in winter quarters, and about 7,000 or 8,000 other members of the church are on the other side of the Missouri River in Canesville, Iowa, and spread out in other settlements all across Iowa. And that was a hard year. They've uprooted, they've left their home. Some of them, for the third, fourth time, they've left their home. And they find themselves living in less than ideal conditions, very, very harsh conditions. And it would be very loose terms to call winter quarters a town. It's shelters that they have thrown up in haste, trying to beat the Nebraska winter, but none of it is what any of us would consider luxury accommodations. And some of them never ended up with accommodations at all, and they spent that year living out of the back of a wagon and in tents. And so it was a very, very difficult year. In that area, on both sides of the river, it was reservation land at the time, and so there were concerns there. You had several groups of Indians on the Iowa side of the river. It was largely the Omaha Indians on the western side where winter quarters was located. The government was very concerned about the Mormons trying to proselytize the Indians, and so try to appease the government. And you could see that in the previous picture. This was the town kind of plat that was drawn up. You can see around the edges there, they fenced in the entire community. And that was as much to keep the Mormons in as it was to keep the Native Americans out. And they did that to kind of appease the government. So they realized we're going to be here for a while, but how do we survive? What do we do for income? And a lot of the men took work wherever they could find it, and that meant they took jobs ferrying furs for trappers down the river, or they found construction work at one of the towns downriver somewhere, which left a lot of families with husbands who were away getting work where they could get it. And it left women doing things that was traditionally men's work, like build your own log cabin, right? Raising cabins and chinking their cabins and doing a lot of that. They ended up doing themselves. And like I said, it was very difficult. And we know a lot about this period. I'm going to reference them a lot today. We have 3 surviving diaries that are very detailed from this time period. Diaries are a great source for history because you're not writing for an audience. And so you tend to be very honest, right? This is just my personal journal. So you're very honest in a diary about what's going on and what you're feeling. And Hosea Stout is one of those. Mary Richards and Patty Sessions are the other ones we're going to rely on heavily today. They kept very detailed journals of this period. And Hosea wrote about it, and you might remember he came up previously. He was the chief of police in Nauvoo. He was the chief of police when they got to winter quarters, and he oversaw all of the security concerns. But on the trail from Nauvoo to winter quarters, he passed the grave of his first wife, who had died when they had to leave Missouri to go to Nauvoo. And so this is, I believe, the third time he has uprooted. But he said this about visiting her grave of his first wife. He said, "I passed by the grave, which was near to the road. I found the palling still around it, which I put there 7 years ago as a last token of respect due to her until the first resurrection. When I left this place, I went disconsolate and alone, mourning her untimely death and my own lonesome condition. But I went to Nauvoo to keep the commandments of God, and instead of being deprived of my last bosom friend, I now had 3 equally dear and confiding in me." When his first wife died on the way to Nauvoo, he'd just recently taken on 3 plural wives. And in that brief period where the Nauvoo temple was open, he had been sealed for eternity to his first wife, whose grave he was visiting. And just to give you an idea of how hard these times were for a lot of them, on April 22nd, Patty Sessions, who was like a midwife she delivered something like 4,000 babies for Mormon women. She was a nurse and the doctor and everything. She delivered a daughter for one of his recently married plural wives. And with a little humor, he said, "This was my firstborn in the wilderness. As some of the old prophets once said, and from the situation of our dwelling, she might be called a prairie chicken." And so a daughter was born to him, but you'll notice May 9th, just a couple weeks later, his 2-year-old son died from whooping cough and what they called the black canker. And it was something similar to like scurvy. And a lot of kids died from it because everybody was so malnourished. And it was just like a black canker, an infection that they would get from lack of nourishment. His 2-year-old son died. That was on May 9th. A little while later, he said, "My wife is still unable to get up and go about, and little Hosea, his other son, my only son now, is wearing down with the same complaint. I have a fearful foreboding of coming evil on my family yet. We are truly desolate and afflicted and entirely destitute of anything even to eat, much less to nourish the sick." And so he lost one son in May. In June, little Hosea died after having such horrible seizures they thought he was demon-possessed at the time. And so now both of his sons had died. And then on September 26th, so I think about the heartache of this. One kid in June, another one a couple months later, and then in September, his wife Miranda and her newborn baby died. She died from complications to childbirth, and the baby didn't make it. That's a lot of heartache in just a few months period. And his words in his journal were, "The destroyer stalked forth triumphantly." And what he recorded in his journal is the same kind of heartache a lot of the other saints were experiencing. We just don't have record of it. For instance, we know that Eliza Lyman, who'd been a plural wife of Joseph Smith, she's now married to, starts with an A, Alyssa Lyman, I can't think of his first name, one of the 12 apostles. She was so sick for so long that she looked like a skeleton, and even people that knew her didn't recognize her. Eliza Snow, one of Brigham's wives, had a fever that lasted for 40 days. And Patty Sessions recorded in her journal that she was so sick for 3 weeks that she didn't have her clothes on for 20 days. Like she was too sick to even get dressed. There was a lot of that going around. And even the apostles were affected. Wilford Woodruff, who was one of the 12, and he eventually would become the 4th president of the church. His young son Joseph died of pneumonia on November 12th. And then on December 8th, his wife gave birth to another baby boy who died 2 days later. And you just think about the heartache of that. He said, "I have never seen the Latter-day Saints in any situation where they seem to be passing through greater tribulations or wearing out faster than at the present time." And you kind of get the idea. That year in 1846 was just a year of hanging on, right? And trying to get through till 1847 when they had plans to go west. So not only was life incredibly hard, it was also incredibly hard to get along. We all know this. It's hard to get along with each other when everything's going great, right? It's that much more difficult to get along when there's not enough to eat and everything's hard and everything's problems, right? Tensions come to the surface, fuses are short, and we see a lot of that in the same period of time where they're going through hard times, but they're having a hard time getting along with each other as well. Eliza Snow said, "There's so much family discord about me, which I think proper to call hell, reigning all around me." The emphasis and the underline there is in the original. That she said, "Revenge and retaliation seemed to be the ruling spirits of each, and the powers of darkness seemed holding a jubilee around us." And Laurel Thatcher says this, in one of the sources for this class, she wrote a book called A House Full of Females. She's LDS herself, and Yale or Harvard professor, one or the other, I can't remember which. She said this in her book, and I found it such a striking comment about this period of time. She said, "The harder they tried to live by the dictates of their religion, the more they exposed their own lack of perfection." And I find that such a telling statement, and an honest statement. And from a Christian perspective, I think an important statement. Because the reality is, pick a religion, it doesn't matter which one. If the tenets of your faith are, we have to keep this list of rules in order to be made right with God, all you're going to do at the end of the day is expose your own imperfection. Right? And that's true whether you're a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Mormon or take your pick. That's true if you call yourself a Christian and we make our salvation about me being good enough. Right? If you just go, I'm gonna be a Christian, I'll keep the 10 Commandments, and a lot of people go, I just like the teachings of Jesus. I'm going to keep the teachings of Jesus. Just go read Matthew 5 through 7 and try to live it. Try to live the Sermon on the Mount. Try to live the 10 Commandments, and all you're going to find at the end of the day is I am exposing my own imperfection. I can't do it. We can't be made right with God by keeping the law. And one of the big distinctions between evangelical Christian theology and Mormon theology is that at the end of the day, we're not made right with God by being good enough. And a Christian would say, I openly and honestly admit I can't be good enough. And that's why we fall on the grace and mercy of Jesus, which is enough to cover our sins and to cover my imperfection, because I can't be good enough on my own. And sometimes even as Christians, we need that reminder that it's not about me trying to earn it. We have to constantly preach the gospel to ourselves, because the harder we try to earn it, the more we just expose our lack of ability to live the way God asks us to live. And they were finding that in this period too, right? We can't keep the precepts of our own religion. And they're all trying to keep, especially, all of these new rules, because polygamy is finally becoming more pronounced. It's becoming more out in the open. And it was hard. Mary Richards was married to a man who was on his mission in England. And he had written to her. She was not a proponent of polygamy. And he had written to her about his hope upon his return that they could add Ellen Wilding, who was a very close friend of their family. He said, I'm thinking about when I get back, I'm thinking about taking her on as another wife. And Mary wasn't crazy about that idea. She wrote back to him in England and said, I was in hopes that after your return, you would have been contented to have lived with me alone for a little season, a comfort which I have never yet been permitted to enjoy, although it's been my greatest desire of my heart. I was really just hoping it could be just us for a while. Mary liked Ellen, but she wasn't ready to share her husband just yet. She wrote to him in another letter, if you had seen what I have seen, you would not wonder why I thus wrote. For there is no such thing as happiness known here where a man has more than one wife. It really seems to me that this is a day in which women is destined to misery. And so she was not looking forward to it. And a couple weeks later, when their friend Ellen finally arrived at winter quarters and she had already married somebody else, she was very relieved. And she greeted her warmly. She'd never been so happy to find out her friend had got married. So not everybody got accustomed to polygamy easily. I like this little poem that Mary recorded in her diary. This is interesting because this poem was one that Violet Kimball, Heber Kimball, member of the First Presidency, one of the 12, his wife had recently given birth to a son, and Violet wrote this poem, and Mary wrote it down. The Lord has blessed us with another son, which is the 7th I have born. May he be the father of many lives, but not the husband of many wives. And so some were struggling, and Heber had had multiple wives by this point in time. But Violet was still struggling with it. I like Mary because she proved adept at standing up for herself. And you go back and read her journals, she was smart as a whip, but not educated. But you could see even in her writing, right, this craving for education, and it just wasn't available at that time and where they were, and she read everything she could get her hands on, and she tries in her journal to write eloquently, but her spelling's horrible, right? You can tell she hasn't had much training, but she's trying to write, and she does write eloquently, and her spelling is horrible, and she was embarrassed by that. But she was just sharp, you can tell, and she was adept at standing up to herself. And I like this one story where the Apostle John Taylor had just come back from his mission in England, and he told all of the other men there that when I get back, I'll go and visit and check in on all of your wives and make sure they're okay. Well, Mary's husband was there, so her husband was one of those men. And so she's having a conversation with him, John Taylor, and his wife one night, when he said he had promised he would go see him, but he said, they haven't even given me a chance to go see him because they're all coming to see me. And they had this hilarious conversation. Mary says, "Accept me, for I came to see Sister Taylor, and shall live in hopes that you will redeem your word and come and see me if Sister Taylor has no objections." And Taylor said, "Well, I feel afraid of going to see the sisters, for the trouble is they all fall in love with me when I do." Humble guy. But Mary's so quick, she shot back, "I expect it is somewhat dangerous, but I would be happy to have you bring Sister Taylor with you when you come and see me. And if I should happen to fall in love with you, I'll try to keep it to myself." Which is just such a great comeback. And then Lenora jumped in and said, "Yeah, they do ask him to visit, but they never say one word to me about going with him." And so I think it was all a lighthearted conversation. But man, she was quick. Patty Sessions' diary, on the other hand, she was nothing but business. She was just busy, busy, busy. And I'll get to some of that in a minute. But she was having her own trouble with plural marriage at this point. Her husband had taken a second wife named Drusilla, who'd made Patty's life miserable. I mean, miserable. In Patty's view, she was nothing but trouble. Drusilla was lazy. She didn't do any work. She took supplies without asking. And the worst part was she spread rumors about Patty nonstop. And by the end of 1846, Patty was just distraught and beside herself. And this is maybe the most lengthy emotional thing she wrote in her journal. She said, "He has lain with her 3 nights. And this is part of what you ran into with polygamy a lot, right? Where one wife's feeling neglected and they're always going into the other wives. He's been with her 3 nights, and she has told him many falsehoods and is trying to have him take her to Nauvoo and then to Maine and leave me for good. I have not spoke to her today, yet she says I have quarreled with her all day long. I go to bed, I know not what to do." Her journals are hard to read because there's no punctuation. And so she was beside herself, and finally her adult son, Peregrine, had had enough of seeing how Drusilla treated his mom, and he confronted her and let her have it and ripped her a new one. And apparently she was chastised, and eventually on December 3rd, she just succinctly recorded, Drusilla started for Nauvoo. She just left her husband and went without him. So all of these kinds of tensions around plural marriage. Wilford Woodruff was having his own struggles. By this point, all of the apostles were practicing plural marriage. But Wilford and Phoebe had been in England on a mission, and he just recently returned. And so kind of the pressure was on. He was very hesitant about it. He was doing it more to be obedient. He had a very loving marriage with Phoebe, but he was under pressure to do it. So he took his first 3 plural wives while they were in winter quarters. But it didn't go well across the board with all of them, because he learned on August 27th, he came back from an expedition across the river to find, in what he calls in his journal, evil in the camp. And what he found out is certain young men had been spending nights in fiddling and dancing. That's a 19th century way of saying partying. Right? They'd been partying late in the night and afterwards leading away young women into folly and wickedness. That's a 19th century way of saying they were fooling around. Problem was, 2 of the young women were 2 of the women he had just married. They were sneaking out and partying and running around with these guys at night. And I think this is some of the difficulty too, if he's a guy in his 40s and they're women in their 20s or younger. I'm not sure how old these ladies were. So he confronted them about it, and he's very hesitant even in his journal about how he talked about polygamy and even that I married other wives. He's never very explicit about any of it. But he confronted them and told them, hey, you got to stay home at night or you can't live here. And so they said, I love his words, they manifested a disposition to live elsewhere. So they did not stay. And those particular marriages, those 2 marriages lasted 3 weeks. At the end of the day. It didn't always go smoothly. The girls in this particular situation ended up getting off easy because Woodruff made a stink about it and told Stout to find the guys responsible and to deal with it. And Stout said these were his orders. Elder Woodruff said that they and the girls had been out for 15 nights in succession until after 2 o'clock, and that it was his wish and the wish of the president that I should take the matter in hand. So Stout tracked the guys down, and the punishment for each of the guys involved was 18 lashes. Pretty severe. But one guy was so relieved because he thought the penalty was going to be death. So he happily took his lashes because he thought they were going to kill him. Another guy, during his whipping, said, oh, if you'll just stop, I'll never touch another girl again, as long as, while hell's afloat. And apparently one of them didn't take it well at all. He got sassy during his whipping, and so he got 36 lashes for it. A lot of people thought this was pretty severe punishment, that they had gone too far, but in their sermons that Sunday, Heber and Brigham both backed up the police and said if the saints were going to survive in the wilderness, then the law of God had to be enforced, and that they were going to be strict about it. So a lot of struggle. And we talked last week about Brigham, some of his struggles in trying to maintain polygamy and in his own family and with plural wives. And kind of the view on it in 1846, the 12 held that no man has a right to attend to the ordinance of sealing except the president of the church or those directed by him to do so. So nobody could seal a married couple for time or for eternity together without the sanction of Brigham Young, or unless it was somebody that Brigham had sanctioned to do it, because he felt like a lot of people were just using this as plural marriage as an excuse to fornicate, right? And they'll go off, and then he said they'll find some lunkhead of an elder to marry him, something like that. These were his words. So he said, we're the only ones that can sanction this. But in practice, what that did is that did a lot to consolidate his authority in the church, because he's the only one who could sanction it and sign off on it. And we see for Brigham in this period of time that just like for Joseph Smith, this doctrine of plural marriage in the celestial kingdom, that was all still relatively new, right? That the chief end of humankind, and this is where we would differ a great degree with LDS theology, that the chief end of humankind was eternal fellowship and familial glory. And I'm building my eternal family. And if you watch even a lot of the commercials and stuff that the church has on TV today, right, that's where they're emphasizing family, 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 and families are forever. Right? They won't spell out this doctrine, but that's still the emphasis, that I'm building an eternal kingdom with my family here with me. And Brigham said several things along those lines, that if men are not saved together, they can't be saved at all. And what is my glory? I find this a fascinating statement. What's my glory? Is my family around me of one heart and one mind. And which I think is quite a statement. From a Christian perspective, our goal, hopefully, we're not working towards our own glory. We do believe Jesus will glorify us. The New Testament talks about that. We will be resurrected. We will be glorified. But our chief aim is not our glorification. Our chief aim in eternity is not going to be building my glory, building my celestial eternal family, my eternal kingdom. Right? It will be the glory of Jesus. That should be what I strive for today, but it's also what I'm going to be striving for eternity, to know Him and to glorify Him. But Young claimed, I would rather be annihilated than deprived of my family and of all society in eternity. So there's a big contrast here between evangelical theology and Mormon theology, where we do, as Christians, we very much emphasize individual salvation. Right? I have to follow Jesus and commit my life to Him. I can't do that for my kids. I can't do that for my wife. They have to decide whether they're going to follow Jesus, whether they're going to live for Him. I can't do it for them. But by contrast, Mormon theology, Young's theology, just like Smith's, centered around extended families. And they emphasize that a lot in this period where polygamy is a new thing, right? And part of the reason we should practice polygamy is because I'm building an eternal kingdom. I'm building an earthly kingdom that's going to lead to an eternal kingdom. And the more wives I have, the more children I have, the more glory I'm going to have in the next life. And they also practiced, and I decided not to go in a lot of detail about it because it kind of came on scene and then it kind of pittered out pretty quick. But during this time, they were also practicing ritual adoption, where you could adopt other people and have them sealed into your family. So like John D. Lee, who you might be familiar with, we'll get to know during the Mountain Meadows Affair eventually, right? He was adopted as Brigham Young's son and sealed to him. In this period of time, Brigham Young had about 300 people in his extended family that he was responsible for. And that's because this idea of that's more glory in the next life. And I don't know the answer to this, and if you're LDS here or you're LDS watching this, maybe you can help me understand it. The part I've never been able to really sort out in LDS theology is, say, my dad was a faithful Mormon. He sealed to my mom. He did great, right? He did all the things you're supposed to do. And I have 2 brothers. He has 3 sons. So we're all sealed together as a family unit for time and for eternity. And then I have 5 kids, and just say we're all faithful, and my kids are all faithful, right? And we're all sealed together as a family unit. But as my family, I don't know how that separates out in eternity, right? Where I'm also working, I will have my own kingdom, right, that I have built that will be separate from my dad and separate from my kids, but we're all together. And so it gets very fuzzy there. And it was fuzzy for the saints, especially with this practice of adoption. Wait, how does this work? And who's going to belong to who and right? And he tried his best to explain it in a way that was clear during this time period, and he only kind of muddied it more. Right? But kind of this idea that he talked about, well, for instance, my family, I will be the big chief, but if I have 10 other chiefs underneath me, this is not he didn't use the word chief, but I'll be the big boss, whatever you want to use, right? I will be the head, but I might have 10 others, right, who are also chiefs, so that just gives me more glory because they have glory, right? And then on and on and on down the line, where everybody's tied together. But that's totally different idea from anything that evangelical Christianity would teach regarding where we're going, what's our purpose, where all of this is heading. And they were very different in their theology in this regard, that this idea, especially in the 19th century, where we see this idea that even is carried down to today. Right? We have this idea as Americans of intense individualism, and way more than most cultures have, where we have this idea, although it's fading, but this idea of this is America and I can make anything of myself, right? And no excuses, I'm responsible for me, and if I try hard enough and work hard enough, you can get ahead, you can make something of yourself. We're just very individualistic as a culture. And LDS theology, and especially this time, was very communitarian in its theology as well as in economics. And we'll see that when they get to Utah. It's not you go out and succeed. They had very much the idea of we go out and we will succeed. We will work together, we can do this, but it's very much community-centered and related. So, differed a great deal there. I think I got time. Brigham's attitude toward women is almost impossible to nail down because he says so many contradictory things. In some ways, he was a product of the time. In some ways, we would go, he was behind the times. In some ways, he was very much a man ahead of his times in regard to his views of women. He said some things that, especially for us reading them today, sound very harsh. He said, a woman is the dirtiest creature, dirtier than a man. And here's why, because men are honest. But if a woman won't lie, she's a miracle. The influence of my women over me is no more than the buzzing of a fly's wing. And he said to the men, do their heavy lugging, but don't wash their dishes as some men do. Which is an unfortunate idea that some might carry down even till today, right? You have men's work and women's work. I debated whether to share this story or not, all the way right up to class. And then I got in a hurry. And I'm debating right now whether I should share it. It's got strong language for 19th century. Like I said, John D. Lee was his adopted son. And he ended up coming to trial in February of 1847, right before they left winter quarters. He came to trial because he was the charges were he was abusing his plural wives. And Brigham took those charges seriously. He condemned him for it, but he also at the same time seemed to take them lightly. Because one of the charges was that Lee had frigged, which is a 19th century word for a word we don't use today, his sister-in-law, young sister-in-law, Louisa Free, 20 times in one night. And Young laughed about it and said, that's the problem with John. He's loved his women too much and frigged them too much. And so he could kind of make light of the matter and joke about it. But despite that, Young also took very strong views against domestic violence and gave women a lot more freedom than they would have had in a lot of other places, that he would write a divorce if a man wanted to leave her husband, which a woman couldn't do most places in that day and time. But if they wanted out, he would write the divorce and he would allow them out. So in some ways, he was more liberal. Contrary to a lot of the country at the time, he didn't believe that men and women had to be in totally separate spheres, right? That there was men's work and women's work. He was very liberal in that sense, that outside of ecclesiastical roles or roles in the church, he encouraged women and said sometimes women are better in those roles and occupations. They should pursue them because a lot of times they're more shrewd and more competent than men with things like financial affairs. And it would encourage women to study in later years law and medicine and things that were very progressive for the time. So he's kind of all over the place in regards to those kinds of things. Just a few things I wanted to share because I find them fascinating. I mentioned Patty Sessions this year in winter quarters was, not just then, but after they got to Utah, she was a workhorse. And so her journals, when you read them, are not eloquent. They're just a to-do list. Did this, right? They're not even complete sentences. It's just, I did this today, and this. They're just a list. And so her journal is very abrupt. But she was busy. In one 3-day period in February, she celebrated her birthday. She attended a gathering of female friends. She danced in the council house at an event honoring Silver Grays, which is what they called senior citizens back then, I guess. But in the same 3 days, she officiated at 3 births, visited the sick, spent time with a dying woman, and had enough energy left to make a batch of soap. And so not surprisingly, when you read her diary, it's just all business. So one day, on Friday the 5th, she said, there's no punctuation, so forgive me. It's hard to get the sentences right. She said, this morning I've been to see Sister Whitney. She is better. I then went to Joanna Roundy, and she said it was the last time I should see her in this world, and she was going to see my children. I sent word by her to them. I then went to the Silver Gray party. Eliza Snow went with us. I danced with Brother Knowlton. Mr. Sessions not being well. Joanna died this evening. Dun, 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 dun. Saturday the 6th, I made soap, visited some that were sick, went and put Whitney to bed. She had gone into labor, went and put Whitney to bed. She had a son born 11 o'clock. Bang, 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 bang. One thing the Mormons were trying to keep in this period of time, Joseph Smith had given the word of wisdom by revelation. It's recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 89. Very famous even till today. This is the passage that they would use to say, we don't drink, we don't use tobacco, and we don't do hot drinks. And the specific passage regarding alcohol said this, I give you this word of wisdom by revelation, that inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it's not good, neither meet in the sight of your Father. But they were pretty lax on it in winter quarters. And after they got to Utah, you see that become much more of a strict law, even down until today. But Stout wrote this humorous account that I wanted to share. That one night, he's at the general store talking to his police officers about the shift that night. They were having a discussion about something when 3 of the apostles, Orson Hyde, Parley Pratt, and John Taylor, entered. And Taylor tells Stout, hey, go on, keep on talking about whatever you were talking about. And Hannah said, no, it's nothing but police business. It's not interesting. And then they had this conversation. Taylor said, well, never mind. We're police too. And Stout said, well, I hope then you will conform to the rules of the police. Certainly, says Taylor. Then bring on the jug, says I. At which they took out the jug that they had hidden. They were presented with a large jug of whiskey. This was such an unexpected turn that it was only answered by a peal of laughter, and they all paid due respects to the jug. And that was the apostles. And you find a lot of that in this time period where, yeah, we're not supposed to, but it was really not that strictly kept. A lot of Stout's responsibilities while they were at winter quarters involved security, and one of the most common complaints that he dealt with was people were constantly accusing the Native Americans around them of stealing their cattle. And sometimes that's because it was true. They were stealing their cattle. And sometimes it's because it wasn't true. And so he spent a lot of his time, that was what he probably investigated the most as the police chief. But one time Brigham was away from camp, and the son of one of the Omaha chiefs had tried to come into town, and Pratt and Taylor wouldn't let him in town. And Stout recorded that young Elk spoke very sharp at this ill treatment and laid it to our chiefs and said that if the big red-headed chief, which is what they called Brigham, and I love that, the Native Americans all referred to him as the big red-headed chief. If he were here, he wouldn't have treated us this way. He would have been friendly and given us something to eat. And Stout intervened and kept them from expelling them and allowed them in and took care of them. So I just like the big red-headed chief, what they referred to him as. His journal in August records this, and we talked about some of his heartache he'd already experienced this year. In August he wrote, Louisa, now my only child, who had been sick for a long time, died today, which seemed to complete the dark curtain which has been drawn over me since I left Nauvoo. My family then consisted of 8 members, and now it's 2. In about 8 months' time. 5 of whom have died, and now I'm left childless. But I shall not dwell on this painful subject. Can you imagine that amount of heartache and losing that many of your kids and your spouses in that short of a period of time? And again, he just recorded what a lot we're going through that isn't recorded. Just quickly, Stout, just because we've talked about him a lot today, He remained faithful. He came with them in 1847. He eventually served an unsuccessful mission to China, along with several others. But in Utah, he was part of the first Utah Territorial Legislature. He was the first ever Attorney General for the Utah Territory. He was Speaker of the House, and at one point was arrested for murder. And so we will get to that story later. He was arrested and acquitted. Bill Hickman actually committed the murder. You might be familiar with Bill Hickman. But he went on to be very distinguished among the saints in Utah. At the end of the day, more than 400 Mormons would die at winter quarters out of the 4,000. So 10% of the population would die over the course of that year. And so this was a hard time for Brigham to hold it all together. Because what do people do? When you're going through hard times, there's not enough to eat. We're suffering. Things are very difficult. People tend to gripe and people tend to complain. And there was certainly plenty of griping and complaining. On the other hand, he had to deal with, you might remember James Strang, who had started the Splinter Group. He was going, things are great over here. Anybody who wants to come join our group, we'd love to have you. And you don't got to go all the way to Utah. All right, so come on over. So he was trying to keep people from peeling off to go follow Strang's movement. And on the one hand, in this period, Young at times could be very caring, and other times he could be very firm. He said some very firm things like this: you must stop your backbitings, speaking evil of the 12, speaking evil of me, or you will be damned. He said on another occasion, Brother Joseph, being very merciful, a very merciful man, bore with these things until it took his life, but I will not do it. Straighten up. And right before they left, he said regarding those causing disruption, if you go with us, if you're going to go with us west in the spring, if you go with us and continue your wickedness, their heads will be severed from their tabernacles or from their bodies. So straighten up or else. And he very much in that winter was trying to get the saints in order because he knew what lay ahead of them was going to be even more difficult. So in January of 1847, right before they prepared to head west, Brigham gave what is his only canonized revelation that's recorded in LDS Scripture to this day. There's just one that came from Brigham Young. And the story behind it is about 2 weeks beforehand, he said he had had a dream in which he saw, in his dream, he saw Joseph Smith approach his mother, who's sitting by the window reading a document. And Smith asked his mom, what have you got there? Is that the Word of God you're reading? And when she said yes, Smith replied, I think you're going to be sick of that pretty soon. Implying that more was needed, more revelation was needed. And so on January 14th, Brigham spent several hours writing the word and the will of the Lord for the people in the coming months. Heber Kimball sanctioned it, stating that this document was the first revelation that had been penned since Joseph Smith was killed. It's recorded today in Doctrine and Covenants 136. It's very long. I'm going to read portions of it. But it's penned in Doctrine and Covenants 136. And it's largely instructions for the church in preparation to go to Utah. But some of the things it says are the word and the will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west. Let all the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who journey with them be organized into companies. And then he goes on to describe how the companies are supposed to be laid out with captains of hundreds and fifties and tens. Let each company with their captains and presidents decide how many can go next spring, and then choose out a sufficient number of able-bodied and expert men to take teams, seeds, farming utensils, to go as pioneers to prepare for putting in crops. Let each company bear an equal proportion according to the dividend of their company in taking in the poor, the widowed, the fatherless, and the families of those who have gone into the army. So they had a hard time carrying out this instruction, but he's trying to think here of all the people who can't afford to get to Utah. Right? Those of you who can, care for them and make sure each company you bring some of those poor and destitute along with you that don't have the means to get there. And especially those whose sons had signed and husbands had signed up to be part of the Mormon battalion. If you do this with a pure heart and faithfulness, you will be blessed. And you'll be blessed in your flocks and in your herds, in your fields, in your houses, and your families. Go thy way and do this, as I have told you, and fear not thine enemies, for they shall not have power to stop my work. Zion shall be redeemed in mine own due time. Thy brethren have rejected, talking about America, thy brethren have rejected you and your testimony, even the nation that has driven you out, and now cometh the day of their calamity. And so again, I know I hop on it a lot, but you see there this idea, thought that this was very much a millennial movement, and the United States is condemned, and Jesus is going to redeem Zion. He's coming back at any time, and he's going to use the church to do it. Therefore marvel not at these things, for ye are not yet pure. You cannot yet bear my glory, but ye shall behold it if you are faithful in keeping all of my words that I have given you. From the days of Adam to Abraham, from Abraham to Moses, from Moses to Jesus and his apostles, and from Jesus and his apostles to Joseph Smith, whom I called by mine own angels and my ministering servants and my own voice out of heavens to bring forth my work. Which foundation he did lay and was faithful, and I took him to myself. Many have marveled, and so here he addresses Joseph Smith's death. Many have marveled because of his death, but it was needful that he should seal his testimony with his blood, that he might be honored and the wicked might be condemned. Now therefore, hearken, O ye people of my church, and ye elders, listen together. You've received my kingdom. Be diligent in keeping my commandments, lest judgments come upon you, and your faith shall fail you, and your enemies triumph over you. So you kind of see this thread through there too of, right? This is God through Brigham Young telling the people to straighten up, right? To prepare yourself for this, right? To heed all my commandments. So no more at present. Amen and amen. That was in January. In March, the first group would set out for the West. And we will finally get there next week with that initial vanguard group, which interestingly enough, I have found a few pictures that survive. And this is that initial group coming in to Utah in 1847, which is pretty cool. And you can tell Utah looks exactly the same in the background as then. Nothing has changed. That's exactly what it looks like now. But we will pick up the story there next week. Thank you guys so much for being here this week. Have a good one.